New North Church, in this text that we're studying today, Paul, who was a church planner, someone who traveled and helped establish new churches, is writing a letter to one of the churches he started, a church in a city called Corinth, which was a Roman colony. It was about 50 to 60 miles west of Athens. It's about as far as Santa Cruz is from where we are today in San Francisco. And it's already been said, but Corinth wasn't by any means an easy city for Christians to thrive in. This church that he's writing to is the first church in Corinth. These were the first generation of Christians. They were attempting to live out their faith in a difficult environment. And the people that Paul is writing to are a group of people he would have known fairly well. He had spent time with them. It's a group of Christians that he had written letters to, a group that he keeps in touch with, a group that he's helping navigate problems and internal disputes. And it's a church with all kinds of challenges. The church in Corinth, it had factions, it had disagreements, it had theological conflict, it had conflict about sexual ethics. Does that sound familiar? And it's actually strangely encouraging to realize that this church, the church in Corinth, faced all kinds of problems that most churches today face, even though they were started by Paul, even though they had direct access to someone today we recognize as an apostle, an apostle and a leader, someone who wrote a bunch of the Bible that we read. Their church still had problems, that they weren't a perfect church. And at least for me, that's encouraging because every church is imperfect. Our family, my wife Rachel and I, we helped start a number of churches. We spent our lives doing church planting. And we worked in Thailand for a couple of years, working to support an imperfect church in Bangkok. And then we moved to Japan, and with a team of people, we've helped start what's now a family of imperfect churches in a number of major cities in Japan. And then we moved to San Francisco about 8 years ago, and we've helped launch, and then I've helped pastor 2 imperfect churches, one of which closed during the pandemic. That's how our family ended up joining New North. Our kids had been connected to New North through the youth programming. And when our church closed this last fall, our family moved here. And even though I'd preached here once, as a family, our very first service was that live Easter service in Pacifica. And so we're still new. And here's what I know already, having been at New North for just a few months. And it's not really because of anything I've observed. It's that New North is an imperfect church. I'm not exactly sure how it's imperfect, but I'm pretty confident that it is. And we look forward to finding out all of the imperfections and writing a very colorful Yelp review. Just kidding. But all churches are imperfect. All of the churches that we started and were involved with, they were imperfect. And if you had the time, I could tell you all of the ways that they're imperfect, a number of the flaws they have, which are probably in some ways my fault. And so I'm counting on New North to be imperfect as well. It's the only kind of church that I've ever known. In this dynamic of imperfect churches, it reminds me of something John Ortberg said of people in his book, Everyone's Normal Until You Get to Know Them. In this book, Ortberg uses an analogy of shopping at a clothing store where everything is imperfect, where all of the clothes come with like an as-is tag. And some of the imperfections, they're obvious, right? There's one pant leg that's too small. There's maybe one pant leg that's too wide. Some of the pants have holes where it's not trendy to have holes. But as-is clothes, like people, like to hide their imperfections, right? Anyone else have pants that have been shrinking during the pandemic? But like I said, as is clothes, they like to hide what's wrong with them. They might look totally fine at first, but then you bring them home, you wear them out, and you realize that something is wrong with them. Something itches, or something has a torn seam, or a funky smell. And like clothes, like people, churches should come with an as-is tag, just to warn us ahead of time, just to let us know we should be looking for it. Imagine if for New North, the people in the parking lot, they're holding signs that say, "Welcome to New North Church. Something's wrong with us. Join us and find out what." I'm only half joking. And I say all of this about imperfect churches, not to relieve leaders from the responsibility to build a healthy and a holy church, or to say that because all churches are imperfect, that there aren't some healthier churches or even some toxic churches that should be avoided. But I want to reorient or temper our expectations of church. And that's one of the things that this letter that we're studying does for us. You know, people often talk about how wonderful churches were in the first century, or how wonderful they are in the third world or in other countries. And we can often be tempted to become unfairly or overly critical of our own churches. You know, I've read about and studied churches in the first century. I've served churches internationally. And guess what? They all have problems. And the existence of these letters to the church in Corinth, they remind us that even with the best leaders, Corinth had Paul, they had Apollos, they had Priscilla and Aquila, Paul sends them Titus, and yet they were still imperfect. They were an as-is church filled with imperfect as-is people. But for me, as a person whose own as-is tag would need to be like very large, I find the reality and the inevitability of as-is churches encouraging, and I hope you do too. So it's to this morning, an as-is church, that Paul, an as-is leader, writes the text we're going to study today. Apparently, as we study this book, we realize that this church wasn't very impressed with Paul. Later in the book, this becomes more clear, but there seem to be a number of people or a group of people who are questioning Paul's leadership, his authority. They're wondering if he is legitimate, especially compared to some of the other teachers they've been hearing from. Paul, he's facing all kinds of other problems and struggles as well. He's facing suffering, and some people saw this kind of struggle he was dealing with as a sign of his inadequacy as a pastor or an apostle. Additionally, they thought his preaching and his teaching was lacking compared to some of the dynamic new voices they were hearing, downloading. And so Paul writes this letter, an imperfect as-is leader to an imperfect as-is church. This morning, we're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, which I'm going to read for us. It says this: "Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." This is an interesting passage. There are a number of truths and applications that one could pull out of it. But as I thought about this kind of present cultural moment, as we are still wrestling with a global pandemic in the midst of a difficult season for many churches and many people, I wanted to focus our study of this text and build around something that Paul says in chapter 4, verse 1. We do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. Just like right now, there were plenty of reasons for Paul to be discouraged when he wrote to the Corinthians. There were challenges inside and outside of the church. There was a famine, and Paul was struggling to raise relief money for. There were people questioning Paul's gifting, his legitimacy, his care for the Corinthian church. Listen to how Paul describes the burden he and his friends have been carrying earlier in the same letter. He says this in 2 Corinthians 1:8. "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself." Pressure beyond his ability to endure, despairing of life itself. Anyone felt like that in this past year? Paul did. He writes from that reality, surrounded by circumstances that should crush him. And yet he says twice in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the text we're studying today, we do not lose heart. He says this in verse 1, and in verse 16, he repeats it, we do not lose heart. And the question we should be asking is why? Why isn't Paul discouraged? How can he continue in confidence and in faith? Why is he encouraged when his circumstances should crush him? And that's what I want to look at and answer today. We're going to look at 4 reasons Paul doesn't lose heart in spite of his circumstances. And then we'll consider what this meant for Paul and what it could mean for us if we follow Paul's example and be a people who do not lose heart, even when our circumstances are difficult. Paul actually tells the Corinthian church in a previous letter to follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So that's what we're going to do today. Study why Paul isn't discouraged, and so we too can attempt to follow his example. Okay, so let's jump into the reasons that Paul doesn't lose heart. Number 1, Paul doesn't lose heart because his ministry is a gift from God. His ministry is a gift from God. Right off the bat, in verse 1, Paul says, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Remember, there are people in Corinth who are questioning Paul's ministry. They're questioning his gifting as a speaker. They're questioning his authority as an apostle. They see the hardships that he's facing, and they conclude that he must not be the best guy to lead or advise this church. And this doesn't seem to be the formal leaders of the church necessarily, but it's a group, it's a faction that thinks this about Paul. Now, to a pastor, if you're a pastor or a Christian leader, this would be intensely discouraging. It would be extremely discouraging for people to think these things about you. Imagine if you were at your own job or school and some group of your coworkers or your clients or classmates basically thought and openly talked about with one another about how they thought you didn't belong there. You didn't have what it takes to do the work or to make the grade needed. That is what Paul is facing, but it's from a people he has loved, he has sacrificed for, he has served. But amazingly, Paul doesn't lose heart. Because for Paul, his identity or his sense of accomplishment, it didn't derive from how his work was received. Instead, he viewed his ministry as a gift from God, an undeserved gift from God. It wasn't something he was doing because he deserved it. He didn't earn his status as an apostle because of his own effort. No, he was called in God's gracious mercy to go and serve these people as a church planter, as a pastor, as an apostle. If you're familiar with or if you remember Paul's story, he goes from a persecutor to a pastor, from someone who is trying to destroy churches to someone who's trying to start churches, from someone who wants to kill Christians to someone who is willingly is willing to give up his own life for his Christian brothers and sisters. It's an amazing transformation, but it happened because of God's mercy, not Paul's efforts or plans. His work was a calling from God, a gift he received. It was an undeserved mercy, not a reward for his efforts. And so even when he faced hardship, when he faced a difficulty, he didn't lose heart. He wasn't discouraged. He didn't feel entitled to his ministry. So he didn't lose heart when someone tried to undermine or question it. And we would do well to emulate Paul and follow his example in this. Each of us, all of us, everyone here, everyone on the other side of the screen has a ministry or a calling, a vocation or a task that we are given by God to do in this season of our lives. And we don't have time to kind of deep dive into that idea and about how you can discern your calling or vocation, but just for the sake of argument, let's just assume right now that your work, your school, your parenting, or your friendships are your ministry. There's something that God calls you to steward and honor him in. Even if you aren't a Christian, I believe there are things that God has put in your life that you have been given to steward. We have all been given ministries. But do we see these ministries as a gift from God, an unmerited mercy? Or do we see them as something we're entitled to, or even something we're burdened by? Even if you went to school for it, even if you put in the hours for it, even if you worked hard to get this job or that relationship that you have, I would still say that we are better served by seeing these ministries and callings as a gift from God rather than wages or status that we deserve. How can we too begin to learn to not be discouraged? How can we not lose heart? Well, we can start by seeing our lives, our work, our ministry, and our relationships as a gift from God. Parents, I'm a parent, I get it, I know. Parenting is hard. But your kids, our kids, are a gift from God. Someone wishes they had the gift of children that you are exhausted by. Students, I know that school is difficult. You might not be looking forward to returning soon, but there are kids in other countries who long and wish for the opportunity to be educated like you are. In our jobs and in our professional lives, it's probably not a perfect situation, but it's better than what many have, right? Someone wishes they have the job that you wake up dreading to go to. And Paul reminds us here that one of the keys to not losing heart is to see all of our lives, all of it, our ministries, our work, our relationships, everything as unmerited mercy, gifts given to us by a loving God. And that doesn't mean it's not going to be hard. Paul's life and circumstances were intensely difficult. But when we start by seeing all of life as a mercy, all of life as grace, all of life as a gift from God, we will be less likely to lose heart, less likely to succumb to discouragement. Okay, so I'm going to look at a second reason that Paul doesn't lose heart. Number 2, because his methods are honorable before God. His methods are honorable before God. In verse 2, Paul contrasts the work that he does and that God has called him to with how he sees others doing the same work. Paul is aware of other people who are seeking to influence the church in Corinth, and he explains how his methods are different and how he seeks to honor God. Let me read for you verse 2. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. It seems that the church in Corinth had been listening to the televangelists of their day, people who distort or deceive, who preach for profit. Just like today, there are people who say they are pastors, who call themselves apostles, who manipulate the Bible for selfish ends. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that just happened. It's a challenge that every church and every age of Christians face. What voices will we listen to? What leaders will we allow to influence us? You know, it's interesting today because of the ubiquity of media. Each of us fashion for ourselves our own sets of teachers and influences. We choose. With the podcasts we listen to, with the social media we follow, with the news sources we engage, we are all curating the information that we will choose to believe and will influence us. And Paul's words here remind us that there are some who seek to deceive, who distort truth. Yes, biblical truth and also truth in general. You know, if you think about all media, it's driven by some kind of profit, by desire for a greater platform, by a need to get more likes or clicks or views. And this is a very difficult environment to navigate. And we need discernment. And if we aren't being discerning, we will inevitably be deceived, or we will have a distorted view of truth. And this is true for everyone, regardless of your political preference, regardless of the medium you are engaging. But Paul, he gives us some insight into how we can grow in discernment. He shows us that we should look for voices that don't distort the data, that don't distort the truth, that we ought to be on guard against deception, that we should listen to those whose methods are honorable, people who aren't afraid to engage the best arguments from other perspectives. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but I'm going to leave that to Rob and to the team there here at New North. I'll let them talk about that. But there's just a lot that we could learn in our contemporary environment about how to be discerning about the messages we're receiving. Like Paul shared the gospel message, the message of the gospel plainly with methods that honored God, we also ourselves need to do our work, our calling, our ministries with methods that are honorable. Honorable in the sight of God is what the text says. We should all strive to be able to say of our work and relationships, look at how I have lived and worked with you. I haven't attempted to deceive anyone. My ways of engaging haven't been shameful. Paul is basically saying that both he himself and the Corinthians could stand before God and would have to say that Paul's ministry was conducted with integrity. And I think all the time how different the world would be if every follower of Jesus could say this. I was recently with a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who's a former pastor who stepped out of formal ministry. And he, about 10 years ago, and he made a decision to create a home construction business. And this guy, he really didn't have a lot of experience in that area, but the city that he lived in was severely damaged by a massive tornado. Thousands of people had lost their homes. And he wanted to serve his community. He knew there would be a major need for new homes to be built. So he and another Christian friend, they started this business. And over the past decade, it's just exploded. They're now one of the 100 largest home builders in America. And I was with him this summer, just a few weeks ago, and I asked him about his new work, this new ministry he's been doing outside of the church building, where he's building homes for people. And I said, what have you learned? What are some of the things that you've learned in this process? And he told me two things. First, he said, it's amazing how far basic integrity will take you. If you simply do what you say you will do, which is so uncommon in his industry with contractors and sales, that it massively differentiates their organization from others. They don't deceive people. They don't hide their pricing. They don't distort. They just plainly tell the truth. This was one of his secrets to business success. And the second thing he told me was that how he was so surprised at the lack of Christian discipleship in the workplace. People who he knew were believers their whole lives weren't living with the kind of simple integrity that he would expect, that anyone would expect from a Christian. They cut corners, they cheated on their financial records, they lived a one way on a Sunday, and then Monday through Friday or Saturday, they lived a totally other way. In their minds, many of the principles that they learned in church didn't really apply to business. And so for my friend, he says that the most important thing he does every week is to disciple his staff to live with integrity in their work. Friends, New North Church, we could have the most amazing preaching here at our church. We could have the best worship and the best services for youth and kids. We could have a world-class building and all of that would make far less of an impact in the Bay Area than if each of us who are believers went out into the world and lived with radical integrity because of our faith in Jesus. If we lived and worked with methods that honored God, if we rejected shameful strategies, deception, distortion of truth, not only would we see a massive increase in the number of people who are interested in the message of Jesus, we ourselves would also be profoundly encouraged. We wouldn't lose heart because we would be able to stand before God and our neighbor with a clear conscience. It would be incredible. Let's move to our third reason and the most important reason that Paul isn't discouraged and why he doesn't lose heart. Number 3, Paul doesn't lose heart because his message is that Jesus is God. His message is that Jesus is God. Unquestionably, without a doubt, the thing that gives Paul the greatest hope, the thing that sustains him and keeps him from discouragement is the gospel message that he preaches and believes. It's throughout this text. That Jesus is God, that Jesus is Lord. Paul says in verse 3 and 4 that the message that he's preaching, it's veiled to some people, that there are some kind of spiritual forces that are working to keep people from understanding the message that changes everything. But Paul, even though Paul has explained this message simply and plainly, it's a message that only can be understood when God opens someone's eyes and removes the veil that's blinded them. And so Paul, he's not discouraged when people do not believe or respond to the message that he preaches. He knows personally that a conversion is a supernatural act in which God must remove the veil so that, like the writer of Amazing Grace says, I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Paul's job is to plainly share the gospel, to believe it personally, and to allow God to work supernaturally in the lives around him. Ours is the same. Paul says in verse 4 that Jesus is the image of God. And in verse 5, he says, for what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Paul, he's reminding the church here, he's encouraging them with the gospel message, the truest source of encouragement, the bedrock on which Paul can live in crushing circumstances without ever losing heart. And I know that for many of us today, we think we know this message. We might really know this message, but all of us need to be reminded of it. If you're new to exploring Christianity, or even if you think you've rejected Christianity, I want to simply read a version of the gospel that Paul clearly lays out. And so that we can be reminded together, hear afresh, or even hear for the first time this gospel message. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. It says this, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I have preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." Paul continues with his own story. "Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, and yet not I, but the grace of God was with me. Whether then it is as I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed." Friends, New North Church, this is the message that Paul built his life upon, that he depended on. It's the message that changed everything for him. It's why, no matter what the circumstances were, whatever he faced, he did not lose heart. This gospel, this message is for everyone. For those who have believed as long as they can remember, and for those of us who are just taking our first steps of faith, this is the foundation in which a life in which we do not lose heart is built upon. Today, we've looked at 3 reasons Paul didn't lose heart. First, Paul viewed his ministry as a gift from God. Second, Paul's methods of ministries were honorable before God. And third, that he built his life upon the gospel message, that Jesus is God. If we can imitate Paul and do these things too, we can be people who can face any circumstance without losing heart. But there's more. For Paul and for us, if we live like this, there is a fourth and final reason that we can be encouraged. And it's this: Paul doesn't lose heart, number 4, because his mission is unstoppable. His mission is unstoppable. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6, the last section that we're looking at today, Paul concludes this portion of the scriptures by saying this: "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of the darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Catch this, guys. Paul is doing something really, really interesting here. He is calling back to the opening of the Bible, to the very first command of God. In the context of darkness, when everything was formless and empty, God said in Genesis, "Let there be light." And there was light. Something inevitable and unstoppable began that day with God speaking light into existence. But there's more. For Paul, light isn't just this metaphor of goodness versus evil, or light contrasted against darkness. Light is intensely personal for him and in his story. It's integral to Paul's own experience with Jesus. It's part of how he understands his own mission in the world. If you were to read the book of Acts, when Paul recounts his conversion, the story begins with a bright light from heaven. Let me read it to you. This is Acts 26. "As I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Is it hard for you to kick against the goads?' And then I asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' 'I am Jesus, whom you were persecuting,' the Lord replied. 'Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to" what? "Light. And from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sin and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." Paul's conversion happened when he saw a bright light. In that light, he heard the voice and saw the face of Jesus. And in that moment, he was set on an unstoppable mission to reflect the light of Jesus to the world. And so Paul, he could endure hardship. He faced persecution, yet he did not lose heart. He fulfilled his role in the mission of God that began in the book of Genesis, bringing light into darkness and God creating a people for himself through faith in Jesus. Paul's story is part of that story. The Corinthian church's story is part of that story. And for each of us who trust Jesus in faith, we are part of that unstoppable story. I love this, that the biblical story ends in the book of Revelation with the description of a new home for the people of God, a new city that does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it. For the glory of God is its light and the Lamb is its lamp. It's in Revelation 21, verse 23. It's an incredible ending to the story. And I want to say today that if you see your life and your ministry and your work as a gift from God, if your methods and your way of living and your practices are honoring to him, if the message that you believe is that Jesus is God, that Jesus is Lord, your mission is unstoppable. It will be difficult, but it will endure because you are part of a larger story where the ending is already known. It is a secure, forever home with God. And so today, no matter what you're facing, you don't have to be discouraged. You don't have to be afraid. You can rejoice in this moment, no matter what you're facing, and live in the light of the knowledge of God's glory, displayed in the face of Jesus today and for all eternity. Let's pray. God, I'm so glad that you sent Jesus, your light, into the world, and that you are actively seeking us. That each of us has our own story and experience with you where you've been drawing us to yourself. And so God, I pray that you would take off the veil for any of us here today who have not yet believed. For those of us who have wandered, God, I pray that your light would beckon us back home, that we would see you face to face, that we would worship you, and we would know that we are secure with you. God, give us a mission like you gave Paul out into the world to be a light to the nations, to our neighbors. God, we do this and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're gonna transition now to a time of communion, a time in which we get to remember in faith that amazing work that Jesus did on our behalf. It's an opportunity for us to respond and to participate together, even though we're apart, in remembering Jesus' death, his sacrifice for our sin and his resurrection from the dead. It's through that act and those acts that we are able to access the life that God promises right now and for all time. So if you're home and you have some bread or some juice or some wine and you want to join us in this time of remembrance, please do. If you need to go grab your communion supplies, go do it quickly and join us, even if it's your first time. The night before Jesus was crucified, he was with his friends, the disciples, and he took some bread and he told them that this bread symbolized his body, that it was going to be broken for them. And he passed it and he gave it to his disciples and he told them to eat it in remembrance of him. So let's take this bread now and let's eat it in remembrance of Jesus' body broken for us. After that, Jesus took some wine, and together with his disciples, he said that this wine, it symbolizes his blood that would be poured out for the forgiveness of their sins. And he told them to drink it in remembrance of him. So let's take the wine or the juice that you have and let's drink it in remembrance of Jesus.